Hello and welcome to a new podcast from WeThe15, the biggest ever human rights movement aiming to end discrimination of persons with disabilities, who make up 15% of the world's population. WeThe15, Access All Areas, is made by the same team behind A Winning Mindset, Lessons from the Paralympics, which was the award-winning official podcast of the International Paralympic Committee. My name is Andy Stevenson, I'm a sports broadcaster, and I happen to have a disability myself. Join me in this new series as we take a look at society and investigate how attitudes can be changed to create more opportunities for persons with disabilities, as well as improving representation and amplifying a range of diverse voices. Let's get straight into episode 1, which is about a huge topic, advertising and media. Thankfully, I'm joined by two brilliant guests to talk about these subjects. First of all, Greg Nugent, the producer of the amazing Rising Phoenix documentary on Netflix, and Martin Beverley, Chief Strategy Officer for adam&eve DDB, a global marketing and advertising agency that, among other things, helped the IPC launch the WeThe15 campaign with a stunning advert.
Greg, I'll start with you. If we just start by looking back briefly, the three of us are sat here in London. London 2012 is like a dozen years ago now. Do you think London 2012 really did sort of change the game?
It 100% changed the game. I think what we'd learned in history is Paralympics was an afterthought, no question. And you could see that because Rising Phoenix tells that story. Some games amazing, other games feel like an afterthought. So, we developed this idea of the Paralympics as a challenger brand, needing to find its own space, not trying to be the Olympics. And it is looking back, but we definitely changed the game, but I think we're up for someone changing it again.
And Martin, I think it's fair to say adam&eve have become involved or synonymous Paralympians more recently, perhaps not so much before 2012, but for you, even as an individual back in 2012, did you recognise that, hold on a minute, wow, this is very different to anything that's gone before in terms of Paralympic Games?
Yeah, the whole London 2012, that just felt like such a huge cultural event. And then the Paralympics felt like a big event afterwards. And I remember the Superhumans campaign. It might be because I'm a little bit biased working in advertising, but I remember watching that and thinking, wow, like that's a big statement of intent. And it really kind of garnered a lot of attention. I think the marketing around both the Olympics and the Paralympics was brilliant, and it just really encapsulated a kind of spirit that I hope has lived on. And I also think it marked a bit of a transition point for the advertising industry to sort of look and think, well, we have a responsibility here to try and change things and change representation. And at the time, I think there were brands like Guinness, obviously Channel 4, but Guinness, Maltesers, that were beginning to show visible disability. And I think far too slowly, but the industry is trying to catch up to where it needs to be. And I think a lot of that was started by 2012.
Do you think there was a nervousness around putting disabled people in adverts, in documentaries, TV programs before 2012?
I don't know whether it would be nervousness. I think it was more just making sure it was part of people's consciousness that this is something where there is underrepresentation here. When you see the statistics on disability, I saw it recently talked about as the biggest minority in the world. Like, it's a huge audience that is underrepresented. And I think the industry has now become just far more aware of that and is trying to rectify what's gone on in the past. And I think that can only be a good thing. I would love to think there is no nervousness and people are just seeing it as a positive opportunity and responsibility. I think it obviously comes with its nuances and its challenges, but there's a huge opportunity for the advertising industry to change the way things are seen.
We'll come on to the WeThe15 campaign in a bit, because obviously that was another, like the Superhumans campaign you mentioned, that was another sort of sea change moment which made people go, wow, okay, this is something very different and impressive. I'm a disabled person myself, and I anecdotally see far more disabled people now just on game shows and reality programs and in the soap operas. And actually, I think what's really good is that these disabled people are now appearing in these programs just naturally. It's not like, hey, and we've got a disabled person here over there. It's just a contestant is on a game show who just happens to be missing a limb or something like that, and it's not really made anything of. Do you think, Greg, that actually the Paralympics has been the driver for seeing more, ordinary, in inverted commas, disabled people on TV?
I think that it's a complex question, because I think Paralympics is unbelievable for the disabled movement. It's complex because not all disabled people want to be elite sports people, and not all disabled people can be elite sports people. But what I think the Paralympics does every 2 years, and I think the Winter Games are getting bigger and bigger, is I think it shatters that myth of a disability mean what you cannot do. I think two things have changed the game show thing. The first thing is, I think Channel 4 in the UK completely changed the game in British broadcasting. And I don't think we've ever gone back. I think the second thing is, I think our television's changed, right? We watch our phones. Apple are making films. I think these companies come in without history. And so they start to think about this revolutionary idea, which is that the disabled person in the script doesn't need to be a disabled person in the script. They need to be a person. If you think about it, if you were to write a script of a village in the UK, we'd say Coronation Street or Emmerdale Farm or something. You would end up with a percentage of that group having a disability and being very well integrated in the group. But then they make soap operas, and guess what? And if there is a story, it's because they need a girl in a wheelchair, right? So that's beginning to change. I mean, I'm watching Slow Horses at the moment, and you can see somebody in there who's got a brilliant job who isn't in there because of their disability. And I think that's where we need to go. There is a lot of nervousness. I think that we do live in an age where if you get something wrong, you must almost never do anything again. And I think we really need to make sure that we encourage more of it. I think it's essential in films, in advertising, in the whole creative sphere. I think this sector could do more than any, because you can change the laws, but it doesn't mean things will change. But what we can do is change attitudes, and I think that is working.
I think that's really a really important point, because the latest statistic that I saw was that it was still only 4% of advertising casting is people with disability. So if you take the 15% statistic, we're really underrepresented still. And I think part of it is doing what you were both alluding to, which is that the casting is implicit. So in 2021, we told a story for Virgin Media that featured a guy in a wheelchair. But it wasn't a story about him being in a wheelchair at all. It was a story about him falling in love online, and he happened to be in a wheelchair. And I think we need to see more of that, where then it's not about being defined by disability. It's just there because it's a part of life. And you can see in that statistic that there's still a gap there. Like, there needs to be more representation, but just naturally in the background, just part of the story, not the story. And I'd love to see more of that in the industry. I
mean, we used to tell this thing, it's true. There's more than 4% of people in Britain that think Elvis is alive. So I think 4% is a statistical error. I think it's close to zero. That's the truth. Like on our films, on our first film, 16%, 16.2%. And BAFTA said, this is unbelievable. We were like, it's unbelievable. And then I thought, why is it only 16? And then, that's not unbelievable. So on our second film, we got to 26%. And on our third film, it's 50. And on our first podcast, it was 62. Now, we are deliberately going over the other side of this, right? To try and always, what's the best talent, disabled and non-disabled, to make our work. But I don't think this industry obsesses about this enough. They just hire crews with 3 days to go. Disabled people in production get emails saying, do you want to be a runner? I mean, it's not thought through properly. And so the only thing I would say that has to change is the amount of time that you put into planning productions. The biggest consequence of our ambitions for disabled representation behind the screen, the biggest consequence of that is we need longer. So actually, we think we need a year longer than one of our competitors would need to put a team together that is equally representative. And I think that is the great opportunity, is not so much because you can see it in advertising now, being cynical. You can see somebody going, let's do the cutaway to the runner with the aesthetic leg. And then you cut away, someone runs through the shot. Tick, we've done it. But I ask, how many people made that film? Because if that film was made in a representative fashion, you wouldn't have got away with it. And that is the bit that I think we can all change.
With some of our clients, we talk about that as like the montage effect, where you go, we've got like 30 seconds or 60 seconds, so we'll make sure that we see a little bit of everyone. And it's not a bad thing, but sometimes you're better off telling a fuller, deeper story through the right lens than just simply a kind of superficial ticking of boxes. I
just want to go back to the Virgin Media ad, because I'm glad you brought that up, and people listening who haven't seen it, I'd urge you to go and find it and watch it. It's because there's two things about that I wanted to ask about. One is that, essentially just to describe it, as you say, it's two young people gaming, isn't it? Sort of online, and then they eventually meet. It's basically a love story, actually. Yeah. And that is the first thing I want to ask about, is that as well as that being an advert which featured a disabled person just because, for no specific reason, but just they happen to be there as the character, it also featured a disabled person in a kind of love story, with a relationship element, which again is actually very rare. This wasn't a disabled person struggling or a disabled person, becoming a Paralympian, as Greg touched upon earlier. It was just an ordinary disabled person doing their hobby, meeting a girl, and off it went. I just wanted to ask, in terms of how the ad came about, was that ad always going to feature a disabled person?
No. So the original thinking was that we'd seen a statistic about more people now meet online than in the real world in terms of dating. And Virgin Media is an internet brand and has internet speed, so it allows people to connect quicker. And my brother-in-law had met his wife gaming. And we were like, well, gaming's a place that people meet, and that's where sometimes love starts. And so we created this story of two young people who met online and kind of interacted, and then decided to take the step of meeting in real life. And then we were like, well, maybe the guy's in a wheelchair. And we didn't make a big thing of it. It was never the focus of the story. But I think we were just thinking about our overall responsibility and just thought, well, that would be a very natural thing to happen.
And the client was on board with that?
The client loved it. Said, well, that would be a great, and said, well, let's not make a big deal out of it. Like, the story could have been exactly the same if he wasn't in a wheelchair. And I think that's kind of what I mean about the implicit representation. And so, yeah, we're really proud of that work. And it told a great story, but it also featured disability, but implicitly, not as, the huge sort of moral of the story.
And when we then roll into the WeThe15 campaign, of course, that is a whole series of disabled people doing, quotes, ordinary things.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's the power of that campaign. I imagine people come to this podcast will have either seen it or will go and watch it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening to this probably. But it's an exceptional ad because it shows disabled people just in their everyday lives, which I know actually sounds very bland when you say it in words, but you managed to make that a piece of magic.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I mean, we're really proud of it as a piece of work, because the original brief was about promoting the Paralympics, and we thought it would be interesting to try and make something that wasn't just for the Paralympians, but was for everyone with a disability. And when we went to speak to people with a disability, they were really kind of emotional and vocal about how they were depicted in the media. And they said to us, well, either it's like pity and it's like sob stories and trying to make people, feel sorry for us, and we hate that. Or it's pedestals where we're depicted as superhumans who've overcome adversity, and that's not. And they talked about inspiration porn, and they hated that too. And they said we just want to be. Oh, it's not special. It's just normal. And I remember them the quotes about we forget to text people back, we wee in the shower, we forget to water pot plants, and we were just like, there's something lovely in the normality of it. And one person said to us that I just want the same shitty life as everyone else. And we were like, there's something in this spirit. And so that whole campaign just set out to show what we all have in common. And also with a bit of humour and a bit of personality in it not feeling too worthy, feeling kind of fun and playful and inclusive for everyone. So yeah, that was the spirit of it. And I'm pleased that it connected with people.
How on earth did you go about the casting process for that ad? I mean, I would assume and imagine you filmed with lots more people on top of the people that sort of ended up in the final cut, did you? But how did you go about finding the people?
Well, we worked with a specialist called C-Space, and our production team just went the extra mile on all of the nuance and all of the detail and got to know the people and made sure that everything, it didn't feel like everyone behind the camera as well. It felt like a really cohesive, I guess, like process that was shared, so that everyone was talking and everyone was sharing, and to make sure that things were represented in the right way. And we deliberately had things in there that maybe pushed things a little bit, and we would record things, but then see kind of how it played out. Because there's the one scene in there where the blind person, and it's like, I'm not praying for a cure, I'm praying for a new handbag. Now, that's quite bold. But that was one of the scenes that people really laughed at and resonated with and said, well, that's just a different way to represent this. It's not the pity that we've seen in the past. It feels more celebratory. But it was a quite intensive process, and to Greg's point, took a lot of time to find all of the right people.
Greg mentioned, like, nobody wants a sort of tick box to say, right, we've got this disability and that one. But I suppose at the same time, you couldn't have had 15 wheelchair users in that ad or 20 amputees and no other disability. So again, I imagine how difficult was that balance? And I guess there was pressure from all different sort of, angles coming at you, we need to reflect this and that.
Yeah, I think there was a conscious decision to try and represent a breadth of disabilities, so not just visible disability where it's very clear wheelchair user, but there's a guy with Tourette's who's in there, and we have things which are less visible, and that was very deliberate, because part of the campaign was to say, actually, there are 1 billion people with a disability in the world, 15% of the population. It's a lot more than you think, and so it was really important that we showed that breadth to just kind of widen people's perception.
Greg, did the WeThe15 campaign sort of hit you as hard as, say, Superhumans had in 2012, and some of the things you shot for Rising Phoenix as well? I'm sure when you got back in the edit, you went, wow, we've got something special here. Did WeThe15 sort of have that same impact on you?
Yeah, I mean, it felt to me like a massive creative evolution, big step, but in a good way. It didn't feel like where Martin and the team were going to the IPC, it wasn't somewhere not predictable, in a good way. I mean, this stuff should be natural. Like, we shouldn't actually, I mean it in a kind way, we shouldn't be too impressed by this. I mean it should be the norm. And I feel what that film did is allow lots of people to feel like things are beginning to change. I don't think the change is substantial enough. I mean, that is the truth. And I'm not disabled, but I've spent a lot of time working in this space, and I feel what we need to get into now is the change. There are laws in America that basically mean you can determine how you pay a disabled person. They don't get minimum wage. There are laws all over the world that you just wouldn't still believe. And I think sometimes being a person from UK and London is you think like things, you think like an amazing things happen. But what Rio taught me, the great and the good, was saying they were going to cancel the Paralympics because it was only for disabled people. And this is 2016. I feel that all of this is a ladder somewhere, but I think the ladder has to be more than perceptional change. It has to be about the issues. We've done 3 films so far under Rising Phoenix. First one was about the origins. The second one's about the athletes, but the third one's about the issues. And when you get into the issues, you're like, wow, like, we have to do something here. And I think other movements are more mobilised.
Do you ever feel a bit sort of like, actually, this shouldn't be up to us, as people who work in the media industry, to fix some of these issues? Because you talk about sort of laws around the world. There are policies and laws in this country, dare I say, that really sort of see disabled people getting the thin end of the wedge. Do you ever feel... Yeah, so, and do you ever feel like, well, hold on, I'm, just a documentary maker. You understand what I'm saying?
I don't feel that, because I was 9 years old when I watched Live Aid. And Bob Geldof could have said, well, there are politicians out there that are going to fix this. And what he chose to do was use immense levels of creativity and audacity. That's what our industry can do. Now, that's the bit I love about what we do. And actually, the politics is always behind something. Politics never in front. And the power people, the people writing the policies, they're behind you. They're behind where we are. So I think what we can do is keep pushing something out further and further, so things become natural that they have to change. So no, I don't actually. I think the opposite. I think we're lucky enough to work in this unbelievable city full of unbelievably creative, audacious people. Multiply that by all the cities in the world that do what we do, we can do something. WeThe15 proves it. The Valuable 500 proves it. The IPC becoming more active proves it. So no, but the only thing for me is it's got to go somewhere further now. We're building up all this awareness. More and more people are more aware of in popular culture of disability. But like you say, in the UK, you could argue we're regressing. So I'd love to now make it more potent and more active. And that's probably where we need to go next at Phoenix is make it a bit more angular and hard to ignore.
And as well as putting disabled people front and centre of the respective, things you guys are working on, you've touched on it already, but the importance of representation behind the camera, at all levels of the planning and production of what you do. So, I mean, specifically, Martin, what would you say Adam and Eve, DDB, are doing in that area, not just when it comes to making content that might have a Paralympic label on, but across all of the work you do?
I think who's behind the camera is so important, and it has kind of been overlooked because it's very easy to tick boxes in front of the camera. And in our experience, when you find the right director and production team, they will tell stories with nuance and kind of more care and attention to detail that might be missed by others. Like, it just allows the story to be told more authentically. So we have an initiative called Fresh Takes here at Adam and Eve, which every time we are going through a production, we will make sure there is someone on the list who has a fresh take and has a background and a way of coming at things that might be a little different. And that was a big commitment that we made. And it's been working incredibly well because we often find that the fresh take is actually the best take. And so we're giving people opportunities to tell stories. And that's not just about disability. That might be race or age or religion or any of the stories that we might tell. But it's something that we're really trying to champion. We would love more agencies, more of the industry to take up fresh takes because we've seen it working for us. It's still a long way to go, but we're seeing it make a difference.
And Greg, I know you always try and commit to having as many disabled people working on your productions as you possibly can. How important is that to you personally?
I don't think we could do what we do without doing that, frankly. I think when we move out of Paris and start thinking about LA, I think we might want to do it in a more systematic way, because I think at the moment we are a bit like, let's do a production and then let's think early and make sure we've got a great team. But I wonder whether we could create a Rising Phoenix Academy of creators on the LA project, and then they get a kind of, like Channel 4 did in 2012, a lot of people came through that production and gone on to unbelievable things. I think we've got that chance now. I mean, it's taken us a long time. Phoenix was originally a film, and then we decided to turn it into we'd listen to great people and they say, build a brand here. And like, that's the thing, is I think we could do something more meaningful. So yeah, look, we won't ever, I think with our films, we'll always try 50-50. It's not always possible. We're beginning to think we're going to make a podcast over the summer. And on our last podcast, we had 62%, but it was during COVID. So everybody was available. Everyone could work at home. And now it's changed again. And you go, what numbers can we get to on the podcast production? It's much lower now. But the team are like, oh, we can't do that. I'm like, of course we can do that. We just very publicly say, across the board, we try and hit these numbers, but not all productions will be equal. What I think we have a chance to do is build a bit of a legacy now, especially out of the LA cycle. Is that's 4 years worth of content. How many people can we work with that then almost become part of, I worked on Rising Phoenix and now I work in Hollywood. So that I'd like to turn it into more of a system, not just a kind of ad hoc tactical production, which is good. I'd kind of like to build something that matters beyond our work. That's probably the bit I'm excited by now.
You touched on it earlier. I mean, I know this from my own personal, working life. Some of the jobs I do, I need to take, an assistant with me. I can think of specialist bits of equipment that I've had bought for me or had to buy myself in some cases to do job. And that kind of comes back to what you were saying about sometimes putting together a disabled production team or, even a 40%, 50% disabled production team will require a lot more time and effort. But but actually in the past, maybe some companies have probably stopped at that point and gone, oh no, it's going to take too long, it's too difficult, too expensive. But you're already sort of striding out there and saying, well, no, hold on. If it's going to take time, we need to take that time. And if it's going to take money, we need to spend that money.
I think so, yeah. But also, we live in an ideas business. So sometimes if you have a new idea, if you assemble a new idea quite late, it's hard to make it as representative as possible. I'm not worried about that because our overall body of work tells you a story that we're trying to be the best at what I think the best in the industry. So I don't want it to stop us being creative, because we should have ideas. And sometimes we might need to go 7% of the team worked on that with. That's fine, by the way. But I'd like the whole thing to drag up. But you can't, sometimes you want that to happen. So it does take a bit longer. Occasionally it might cost a bit more. But the story's better. They're told better. They have greater levels of empathy. They're better produced. The thinking around scripting and treating and the camera work is better. So we make better work, which is why I think we're lucky. Lots of people want to now work with us, because I think they can see what we put in to making the magic bit work. It's not enough for us just to make the bit that comes out on Netflix. It's the bit that happens behind it.
Obviously Paris next, but actually LA seems to be so crucial to everything we're speaking about here, because so much of the stuff that comes out of our industries comes out of America, comes out of the West Coast. It feels like in my conversations with people in America around the Paralympics in LA, it feels like they are where Paralympics GB and Channel 4 and other bodies were in, let's say, 2009, 2010, where it's like, okay, this is our moment to suddenly increase the number of disabled people you're going to see on American television, for example, or in adverts. Is that sort of how you see it as well, that actually Paris is important, but LA could be huge across the world, globally?
And if America really gets behind it, it can be huge. Plus, you have some of the biggest brands in the world that are based in that region. So I think, to Greg's point earlier, the Valuable 500, that can make a huge difference, because the brands involved in that and signed up, they can do huge things that really do change lives. So I think you might find some of the big brands really getting behind, and that will make an even bigger difference. So I can see it being a huge event.
The reason why the brands will find this LA thing super interesting is not because it's good politics to look good in advertising. It's because they know there are so many customers that they're not talking to. That's what's driving the advertising briefs and then the commitment to media investment. So no, I think LA will totally change the game again. And I think Paris will be a step to that. I hope they beat us, but I definitely, LA will be, and I hope they innovate, because, that's what we did. We built our own program for the Paralympic marketing. We hired Channel 4. I remember somebody say, has anyone ever sacked the BBC? And it did make us think, But I hope they innovate. That's why the brands, they'll get it first. The legislators will get it last, but they'll get it. And the public will completely see and fall in love with the Paralympics. It'll be on a global scale.
And don't you agree there's so much to the Paralympics that is of so much more interest than just the athletic performance? All of the amazing range of equipment athletes use, some of the, not even just the equipment actually, just some of the techniques, if I can put it that way, that an athlete might use to get around a particular impairment. There is so much for both viewers but also brands to get into there, isn't there?
I think what we never thought with Rise of Phoenix we'd be making more than the first film. That was what we only thought. But then when we got into it, we're like, God, no one's ever told these stories in depth. And even now, frustrates me. We make a film, the first film, this Bebe, but she probably only gets 8 to 10 minutes in a film. And you're like, shouldn't she have an hour and a half to tell her story? So the big thing that I think it will come our way is more and more need. We used to have a rule in 2012 which was called Know Our Bless, right? That we actually hired Channel 4 on the principle of Know Our Bless, because we brought in a brilliant psychologist called Dr. John Armstrong, the IPC will remember. He basically said what you said, which is that in the end, we don't watch sport for anything other than the sport. we love the circular kind of economy of what's going on in that story, but no "ah bless." And so on 2012, when people go, "Oh, we've got an idea," and you go, "ah bless," and it'd be zero, like doesn't get in. Channel 4 were hard on that because they did the opposite of "ah bless." They did, these are elite performers, like some of the most impressive people in the world. So, you know, like you say, if Hollywood now gets the chance to do that, things will change and the legislation will change. But not just Hollywood. Like, I love the idea of the Olympic Paralympics going to India because Bollywood could smash this. You get me? Like, we work in a world where we use culture and entertainment to change things, and that's the exciting bit.
Yeah, it reminds me that we used to have a similar role in our office when I was working on the Paralympics TV coverage. No VT was allowed to have a Coldplay soundtrack. And I actually quite like Coldplay myself, so it wasn't anything specifically against them, but we just weren't allowed to use one of their kind of typically tinkly sort of maudlin, sad Coldplay piano soundtracks over any of our VTs. I suppose France and the USA are a lot more predictable, I guess, in what their responses are going to be. Would you agree?
I think that pre-London, that was the dominant communication model. And we actually made it a brief for the appointment of the broadcaster to change it. So the pre-London, I think the model was camera goes in, talk in order of this person, how they acquired or were born with a disability, do the pity, and then talk about the sport. And what we basically worked out with a couple of years to go before we briefed for the media is that you'd have to change the order of that. So you would have to say, for this to be taken seriously, for people to buy 3.1 million tickets, you know, like, you can't sell out something through pity. You'd have to say something like, Johnny Peacock, seasonal best in Lausanne, is hoping for a PB of, as trained in Atlanta. You know, like, you'd have to do the story of the sport. That's what Paul does. And then you go, if there's space, then talk about it. But I think that was a dramatic change in the model for London. And actually that led us to Channel 4 because they didn't want to do that. But I do think that sometimes when I hear that, I think I become more determined to do the thing they say don't to do, which is what I think Channel 4, you know, the last leg was unbelievable. Actually doing most of the disruptive communication around the London, it was almost all in that half an hour. And people are so nervous about it. But I think, like in America, I meet a lot of very high-powered Americans, and they call the Paralympics a cause. And I'm like, yeah, it's not a cause. You know, like, but I can't wait to talk to you in 2029 because you won't think of it like that at that point. Because, you know, so look, I think the reason we exist is if you waited for the Paralympics to visit every city in the world to change the way it thinks, we'd all be dead. And so what we think is we can fast track that by making exquisite stories and putting them on brilliant platforms and getting big audiences. So that's kind of, you know, we're the drive to survive of the Paralympics. That's what we're trying. That's what we are. And we help them tell their story.
Have you seen that thing where, you know, we don't want to criticize one particular sort of culture or country or anything, but did you see a different response to WeThe15 across different areas of the world? Was it as simplistic as that, or did you get positive and negative from everywhere?
Yeah, I think it was largely positive. We had some amazing comments from people all around the world, but I think that was because we were focusing on the humanity. Some of the humour pushed it a little bit, but I think I completely agree with what Greg said. What we did was shouldn't be seen as revolutionary because we were just celebrating the people and the humanity. And that should be the norm. And I think that's why people responded really well to it. But I think there's a huge opportunity with LA to go even bigger, even bolder. So I love the kind of like, let's be ambitious, let's be expansive. This isn't about correcting a kind of -1 to 0. It's about the amazingness that can follow. And I'm not sure the industry does a good enough job of talking about the fact that it makes the work better when you have a more diverse crew. And I've seen lots of clients when they feature diversity in their advertising, it creates more affinity, it creates more likability for that brand, and that's good for business. And so I'd love to see everyone being more front foot on it and just talking about the amazing possibility. And you'd think LA would do that. It's just, it feels like it's in their nature to go even bigger and bolder.
Yeah, I think one of the stories actually that we never talk about is why was 2012 so successful? Because there's a lot of people that worked on it, but it was nearly It was as close as you could get as being representative to everybody. So everybody that, you know, when Jean Tomlin was the HR boss of that, she just obsessed by how do I get the most representative team? So this feels like it's all of us. And that doesn't mean disabled, non-disabled. It means Scottish, English. You know, like the whole thing was for everybody. And I think the reason it was so successful is everybody was in it. It wasn't a dominant group with a minority pushing for influence. It was just like this, what Paul and said, Bill, was this unbelievable feeling where you felt everyone was being represented. And of course, Paralympics part of that, major story of that. But that's the chance for LA. And you know, let's see how Paris do, because I'd love them to have the greatest games in history, because it would just make LA go even further. Paralympics can be this unbelievable force for change. It's becoming more activist, and I really like that and admire it for it. And LA, it shouldn't be seen as like the topping out. It should be seen as like a new level, which means that every country thereon in goes higher than.
Here's a left field question for you both, which I've just sort of thought of now. I've got a 6-month-old son. I'm watching a lot of children's TV at the moment. And actually, I've been so impressed by the amount of disability representation in children's television. You know, this was an area that my first child, I never really watched children's TV since I was a kid. And you never saw any disabled people on TV when I was a kid. And again, it's sort of subtle. It's natural. You know, CBeebies, BBC's children's service here in the UK has a presenter with Down syndrome. He's just there doing his thing. It's never really made a big thing of. So many of the cartoons, albeit from around the world, different countries, have characters with disabilities. So do you both feel actually you target kind of young people enough in what you're doing? I know like your content, both adverts, documentaries, etc., is probably aimed at adults, but I always feel that like if you show disability to children, they'll just accept it. You know, I'm hoping my son will just grow up and go, "All right, well, Daddy's got no arms. That's okay, fine. We'll deal with that." So, are you guys, the organisations you work for, doing enough or anything towards sort of targeting young people in that sense? Do you feel as though children will watch WeThe15 and pick up what you're trying to do?
I hope so. I think like we have to design advertising so that because it may be seen by everyone, and so it has to have that universal positive appeal. Like, I think it's a really interesting point you raised that like changing things for the next generation starts early, and I think children's television probably is ahead. I don't know the stats, and Greg will tell me that my stats are wrong and Elvis is still alive. But I think that's a really interesting way to look at like the next generation. So by the time they are of the age where they can make decisions and change things, like to them it feels very natural that is the way that the world works.
Because I think the BBC are extraordinarily good at this. But I think also the global platforms are quite good at this. So I agree with you. It's an amazing like space to think about. Your question was, are we doing enough? The answer is completely no. Phoenix has been hard to build to get this far. This will be our biggest year, I think. But I definitely want to create something, and I've got something in here about what we're thinking about LA, on how we have a conversation with a much younger generation. I mean, broadcast is on linear TV stations and kids watch YouTube, so it's all going to change. And I'm interested in how we get into that. And I think LA is a big enough idea to do that.
It's really interesting when you talk to people who have a vision or have achieved big things, it often does come back to something they saw in their childhood that really influenced them. And I've seen that's very interesting to think about LA as not for the people of that generation, but for the kids watching for almost 20 years' time.
On our first film, we were like, how on earth do we finance it? And everyone was like, don't go near it, Greg. It will lose you so much money. Your career will take a nosedive. I thought, great. Like all these risks that feel right. But then we wrote to Barbara Broccoli and we wrote to Richard Curtis and said, look, we've got this idea. It's brilliant. The world needs it. But the industry's saying it's a crap idea. If you come in as exec producers, we would want you to properly help us, but we promise not to ask for too much time. And both of them say, no, I'm in. I want to help and I want to put my full time into this. And the thing is, you have that on an industrial level in LA, where you've probably got an awful lot of people who are probably very privileged, but actually will have been touched by disability. And so the question is, how do we harness their power? I mean, that's bigger than anything, frankly. I mean, I think you could do the same in India and other big cultural centres, but big ideas that will form, I think, or should form in that space. And I think a lot of it will come through people, their deeper passions to try and, I think, make the world a better place.
Martin, where do you see sort of this going in terms of advertising? Do you think we'll get to a place where, I don't know, let's just sort of, to a certain extent, pluck figures out of the air here. Do you think like we'll get used to seeing disabled people on every, 10th billboard and every third TV advert might have a disabled person in it? Do you think we'll get to a point where actually disabled people feature so heavily in advertising that actually you sort of don't notice them? I mean, do you think we're actually getting towards that point already?
I hope we get to a point where it's completely normal and you almost don't notice, because at that point we've reached where we should be. The statistics that I've seen, maybe a year or so behind today, are that we're not near that and we're not changing quick enough. So the 4% statistic, even if that is or isn't, it's too low. It needs to be 15, 20.
You've got 11% to go.
Yeah, exactly.
At
so
least, yeah.
I would love us to get to that stage. I think the industry is slowly catching up to where it needs to be. And the reason I quote statistics is sometimes that is what makes the change once people have to become accountable. That we have a gender pay gap and that has to be published. And suddenly the people in power need to be seen to be changing things. And that may sound a bit cynical, but I almost think maybe we need a little bit more of a forthright target on disability to say, hey, we're not up to scratch and we need to be changing quicker.
But that's where it gets really interesting. And your question earlier about, should the lawmakers rule this? So the really interesting thing is, you've now got more and more brands wanting to use disability in their communication because they can see a target audience and they think we want to connect with them, do more business with them. Many brands in the world don't report on disability representation in the workplace. And what will happen is that will snap. If you're going to put disabled people in your advertising, in your very expensive advertising, the community will expect you to report on what you're like as an employer. That's a really exciting thing. So actually, I would say keep pushing the creativity, keep pushing the image side of this, because the hard facts will follow, and the industry, the community, all of us, not just disabled but non-disabled people, will say you can't do that and not do that. They both have to happen. Now, if the creative sector was able to keep pushing that, what a legacy is to have every company in the world openly talking. I sit on the board of the Valuable 500, but what Caroline is doing is remarkable. But imagine every business having to say, over the last year we've had X%, and imagine them saying it's less than 5%. Well, imagine if they then said we'll improve it. It's fine. It doesn't matter that it's 5. It matters that you're going to move it. So that's, for me, that's where the disruption comes from, because this sector has the ability, therefore, to change the entire system, because the system at the moment doesn't work if you're disabled. The employment prospects are dreadful. That has to change. That's where I think it gets serious. You can't just, what's the famous expression, where you be, I think you said it earlier, you don't make the work about us without us. And you've
got to see it to be it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think following up with, if you're in an ad, then we want to see how many people you put. The world will change.
Yeah, because we saw something quite interesting off the back of the WeThe15 launch. The symbol became just such a positive thing to people. If a brand or organisation was associated with it, a bit like B Corp for being good for the planet, and people were like, well, I'd like to work for a place that has that ethos and that commitment. But it hasn't yet become something that people really have to sign up to and become accountable for. And it's not, I know that that's quite militant, but it gives people a standard to set. And then there are so many positives that come with it, because you will recruit better people over time. And I think I would love that to be where this goes. I feel like we need to play catch up versus some of the other movements that have made positive change.
Well, thank you both for your time. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you agree. That was a fascinating chat with Greg and Martin on advertising and media. Next week's episode should be just as good. It's about technology and innovation. I'll be joined by Bernard Shearer out in Nairobi. He's from the Global Disability Innovation Hub. He has brittle bones and scoliosis. And Simon Urier, the man behind an animated character called Ben the Koala. All will be revealed next week. Join us then.